On the morning of Sunday, September 3rd, 1939, the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous arrived back in its home port of Plymouth. She had been away for weeks, and the crew were looking forward to some much needed shore leave. After barely a few hours with their families though, the entire crew received a summons back to the ship. Britain was now at war, and Courageous was to sail at once to hunt for U-boats. Exactly 2 weeks later, she was hit by 3 torpedoes fired by the German submarine U-29, sinking in 20 minutes with the loss of 518 of her crew. Courageous was lost in a period of the Second World War known strangely as the Phoney War. This term is commonly used to describe the months between the declaration of war by Britain and France and the German invasion of the Low Countries in May 1940. It's a time where it's thought little fighting took place despite a state of war existing between the two sides. Throughout it, Britain was led by Neville Chamberlain, a doddery old man who preferred to drop leaflets rather than bombs on Germany. It's a nice narrative, and it's one that sets up the British transition from incompetent to determined as the war progressed. The only problem is that it's simply not true. Don't get me wrong, a Phoney War did exist, but only militarily in France, on one particular front in one particular theatre. Elsewhere, the Poles and Finns fought bravely against huge odds, the Chinese continued to battle the Japanese, and the British, German and French navies traded blows in the Atlantic. Courageous was the first major victim of the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign which began with the sinking of the liner Athenia less than 9 hours after the declaration of war on September 3rd. This campaign was not some sideshow to the events in France in 1940, but an immediately desperate struggle for survival between the Royal Navy and the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine. Less than a month after the loss of Courageous, things got even worse with the British when the German submarine U-47 crept into the naval base at Scapa Flow undetected. Skippered by Lieutenant Gunther Prien, the submarine moved silently past the anchored British ships and hit the battleship Royal Oak 4 times with torpedo. Capsizing at her mooring, Royal Oak sank with the loss of 833 sailors. By the end of 1939, 221 Allied merchant ships had joined Royal Oak and Courageous in being sunk. 9 German U-boats had been destroyed in return. It was an intense start to a campaign that would last the entire duration of the war and would be fundamental to its outcome. For those serving at sea, the war was extremely real, extremely quickly. And nor was the fighting during this time limited just to the Atlantic. A fully fledged military campaign took place in Norway after the Germans invaded on April 9th. It was a 2-month battle that involved tens of thousands of troops on both sides, ending in Allied defeat only after thousands of Norwegian, British, French and Polish casualties. As the war in Norway began a month before the invasion of France, it's often forgotten, lost in the hazy memory of the Phoney War. So if the military reality was evidently so far away from being a phony war, where does this idea come from? Well, to answer that, we need to talk about the war experience of those living far from the front lines, back home in Britain. By the time war was declared, the British government had already spent months preparing for potential dangers to the British home front, and top of the list was the threat of large-scale bombing by the Luftwaffe. Believing that the bomber would always get through and seeing the damage inflicted by the Germans during the Spanish Civil War, the British massively overestimated the damage that could be done by their opponents. They projected that the first few months would result in 1 million civilian casualties and 3 million refugees being created, along with the destruction of most of London. Faced with this grim picture, all the stops were pulled out to mitigate it. Gas masks were handed out, plans for a comprehensive blackout put in place, and a programme of evacuation begun, which took at least 3.5 million people out of threatened urban areas and into the countryside. By the time war did break out, the UK was a country collectively braced for the worst, and then it just didn't happen. No bombers came across the channel to deliver the expected rain of fire. For months after war began, the danger that Brits thought to be the greatest of the war simply failed to materialise. To a public that had been forced to send their kids away to the country and forced to drive around with their headlights off in the pitch dark, it's not hard to see how the war suddenly starts to seem a non-event, particularly when you compare it to the more obvious sacrifices made in later years, such as the Battle of the Britain or the Blitz. The lack of activity on the Western Front in France compounded this feeling, creating this sense that it wasn't a real war, because it seemed so different from what the public had expected and what they had experienced in the First World War a generation before. A real disconnect developed between the experiences of those fighting away from Britain and those at home who could see little change from peacetime. You can see this in another part of the scene from the 1958 film Dunkirk I showed at the beginning of this video.
This phony war business.
Well, isn't it?
No, it's not. I've just come out of hospital after 10 days in an open boat off the Faroes, and I'm sick and tired of blokes like you with soft jobs ashore. I've lost 2 fingers off that hand, but I'm going to take you outside and knock your block off with my right.
Here you can see a clash between these two worlds, the civilian and the military, at a time when their wartime experiences could not have been more different. Despite the efforts of historians and movies like Dunkirk, the phony war myth has remained prevalent. This has to do with how the war is remembered by people born well after 1945, and in particular the way we remember two men, Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill. Churchill is the most famous British figure of World War II, and his reputation as the man who won the war has only grown as the decades have rolled by. His elevation to Prime Minister in May 1940 takes place at the exact moment that Germany invades France, providing a really clear moment which has been used to differentiate between the phony war when Britain wasn't really fighting and the real war, when her qualities of bulldog spirit were evident, embodied by Churchill. Chamberlain, by contrast, is remembered as everything that Churchill wasn't, an appeaser who had overseen the phony war and bungled any military actions that he did take. He was famously described by Spike Milligan as a man who did Prime Minister impressions. As always though, things are not quite so clear cut. Chamberlain was ultimately forced out due to the catastrophic failure in Norway, but he was replaced by a man who was far more responsible for the defeat than he was, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. But such details have been forgotten. Chamberlain has become a prop of the Churchillian legend, the leader whose incompetence magnifies the accomplishments of his successor. According to the cultural historian Mark Connolly, he has been remembered in order that he might be forgotten. This memory of Chamberlain plays a key role in shaping the phony war concept. After all, if you accept that Chamberlain was so abysmal and you consider the huge effect that Churchill had on his war effort, it logically follows that in the time Chamberlain was in charge, Britain's war effort must have taken on the same characteristics: muddle-headed, incompetent and complacent. And so the phony war myth perpetuates itself through a weird kind of circular logic. The phony war was phony because Chamberlain was in charge, and it was because Chamberlain was in charge that the war was phony. The reality is that the difference between Britain's approach to the war before and after May 1940 was not as large as is often thought. It is absolutely the case that Churchill and Chamberlain were key influential figures in their respective government, but one man does not make a war effort. Like with so many other events in World War II, the phony war myth takes a complex time and simplifies it to an easily understandable narrative that turns out to not really fit the historical reality. I'd also like to thank my patrons for their continuing support. If you like my stuff and want to see me make more and higher quality YouTube videos, then consider joining their ranks. For just $5 you can get early access to each video and access to polls to help choose the topics those videos are about. As always, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.